Hi, this is Lily Vogelisang here, recording a demo video for Storyboard Pro 3D. This is after Service Pack 1, where we have now introduced the concept of having also a flying camera in the Storyboard Pro 3D software. So first I'd just like to introduce you a little bit to the interface now of Storyboard Pro 3D. What we wanted to do with this software was we wanted to create a software where people could work in 2D for the scenes where they don't need to have 3D involved in their scene, and then they can also work in 3D for those select scenes where they need to, for example, import a 3D model and that sort of thing. So if you don't do anything, let's say I just start to draw, I can use my regular brush tool the way that I would before. I can have my brush preset toolbar set up so I can select my rough brush and I can start to draw something. And so far I haven't done anything remotely 3D, and that's totally fine. So if I don't need to have any 3D objects in this scene, then this scene can exist as a two-dimensional scene, and I can move on to the next scene by adding a new scene here. Now let's say on the second scene, perhaps on this scene I do want to import a 3D model, or perhaps I'd like to do something where I'd like to rotate a drawing layer in 2D. So let's start out first with the easiest concept of having a 3D scene. So if you want to add a 3D model into your scene, then you can go into your 3D models folder over here, and then if you right click on the right hand side, you can select import files, and then you can import a file from your file system. And I'm just going to import this pirate ship here that's available on our website, by the way, for download if you want to try to use this same pirate ship. You can import in here an FBX file, a 3DS file, an OBJ, and this OSB file, which is the one that I'm using right here. And I think that probably the best one to use at the moment is the FBX, and the reason that I say that is because it packages together the textures with your model, and it does the same thing with this pirate ship here as well, which is in the OSB format. If you're working in a format like 3DS or OBJ, that does not package the textures in, so you do need to manually copy and paste those textures into your project directory. But let's not worry about that for now. Let's just find out what I did here. So you can see here, as I dragged and dropped in my 3D model, it gives me a warning message saying a 3D layer was inserted into the scene. The scene will automatically be converted to 3D. So what this message is trying to tell me is that now that I have inserted a 3D model into my scene, it's a 3D scene, so I need to be aware of that because of the way that 3D is represented in the camera view. So I'll click on OK for this one, and if you understand this message, then you can choose not to show the message again, because otherwise it's going to show this message every time you drop a 3D model into your scene. But for now I'll just click on OK. And then the next thing I'd like to do here is I might want to resize this ship. At the moment I seem to be looking kind of at the interior of my ship. So if I want to resize it, I can use the first frame or the last frame transform tools here. So let me click on my first frame tool. And then you'll see that there is a box, and then there's a circle. This is a super transform tool. This box around the outside, though, if I drag on that box, it's going to do a uniform scale along all axes, so it's really easy for me to just pop that whole ship along there. And then if I want to rotate it, for example, in Y, I can rotate it in Y there. And you'll notice as you're mousing over, it gives you a little, it says X as I mouse over the X axis, so it gives you a hint of which axis you're doing. And if you do drag on this outside circle, it's a free rotate in all directions. So just be aware of that. And then sometimes when you're positioning your 3D object in here, it might be a little bit difficult to get it at exactly the right spot now from the stage view. And so you might want to take out your top view. I usually like to put my top view on the side here. And if you don't already have a top view showing, let's just exit out to show you maybe you don't have these things showing. Maybe you just have something like this. If you'd like to add your top view in, you can click on this down facing arrow and then select top view. So now that I've got my top view in there, I just might want to be able to manipulate that. So I'll just click on the last frame and back to the first frame tool again to bring up my manipulator. So you can see here how I can manipulate my ship now from all axes. So one of the things that I think is a little bit of a difficult concept when you're picking up Storyboard 3D is this concept of the difference between the stage view and the camera view. So let me talk about that a little bit now, because this starts to become important when I'm starting to work with 3D objects. When I'm looking at the position of my object from the stage view, think of this stage kind of like a stage that you're going to stand on when you're acting. Like it's to set the stage. It's how you are looking at the entire environment. It's a lot like a perspective view. So if I'm using, for example, if I want to move around in my stage view, I can hit my space bar to pan around from one side to the other. And you'll notice even just as I pan there that the frame, my camera frame, no longer lines up with my ship. And that's okay, because this camera frame here is just a representation of where my camera is in that shot. And so the stage view is not really used to actually frame your ship with relation to your camera. It's used to place your objects with relation to each other. So let's say, for example, if I had two ships in here. Let me bring in another copy of my ship, and I'll scale this one down just like I did the first one. So let's just say these guys are at war, got these two ships, and they're coming towards each other like that. I want to make sure that they are, placed in a smart way, and that they are scaled in a smart way with relation to each other. So this is really not fair because one is a lot larger than the other. So let's make them about the same size. And make that one a little bit bigger there. And then I'll move this one backwards. And then I might want to check out now from my stage view what these look like from a different perspective. So in your stage view, you can still use your rotary light table to rotate around your workspace. And that rotary light table is going to be Control and Alt, or Command and Option on Mac. Now we've added an additional shortcut here, which is Control Shift or Command Shift on Mac. And this is going to let us rotate around our stage view like a perspective view. So you'll see here that the stage view is really a free view that can be used to position objects with relation to each other. So even if I had a two-dimensional layer in here, like let's say I've got my A layer, and I'd like to make sure that I'm going to draw, I'm going to place my A layer in the right spot. Well, there's two things to be aware of here. The first thing is, when you want to draw on a two-dimensional layer in a 3D space, you'll notice if I click on my drawing tools here, I get the no entry sign. And the reason I'm getting that no entry sign is because I'm not perpendicular to my drawing layer. So I need to reposition myself in order to be able to draw on that layer. So one of the things that we can do here, I'm just checking out my tool properties for my brush tool there, but if I want to be able to snap to that layer, then I should go into my preferences. And inside your preference file, if you go to View, then there's an option here called Look at Selected. And what Look at Selected is going to do is if you assign a shortcut to it, and it looks like I just assigned my sort of, one of my apostrophes there to that key, but you can assign any shortcut that you'd like to that key. And when you assign that shortcut to that key, then when you have a drawing layer selected and you hit that key, it's going to make that drawing layer always perpendicular to your stage view there. So it'll just pop your stage view to where it needs to be. So now let's say I just want to draw a really simple looking character here. And this character, let's say, is going to be standing on the prow of a third ship over back here. And maybe I'll give him some kind of a pirate hat. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to make sure that I'm positioning my two-dimensional layer where he belongs in 3D space. So if I can take exactly the same first frame tool, and I can use it on my drawing layer, but I probably also want to just reposition it so that it makes sense from relation to where my drawing layer is, just to make it a little bit easier for me to position this drawing layer. And now with my drawing layer selected, I can move it around, and I can take a look at it in my top view to see where he is in my top view. Maybe I even want to do something like Maybe I want to rotate him so that he faces the other side, because maybe I didn't draw him the right way. So there he is now facing the other side. And then I could make him a bit smaller and put him somewhere on that ship. So this is the real strength of working in Storyboard 3D, is that you're actually going to be placing your two-dimensional layers in space where they belong with relation to your three-dimensional layers. So now you'll remember that I mentioned that there is a difference between the stage view and the camera view. So let's talk about the camera view for a second here. What the camera view does is the camera view shows the position of the camera from the current frame. So in this case, I don't have any camera move on this camera, so it looks the same throughout my camera. I can also click on the camera mask so that I can, just see exactly what's framed inside my camera. And I find this quite helpful because sometimes you might think you have distortion in your scene, but the distortion is around the outside. So one of the things that you need to be aware of with the stage view and the camera view is that this stage view is just an approximation of what you're seeing from your camera view. And then if you want to actually see what you're seeing from your camera view, you really do need to go over here to your camera view. And this becomes even more important when we are actually doing a camera move. So let's go ahead and do a very easy camera move on this scene to show this concept. So I'll go ahead and click on my camera tool, and just like with Storyboard Pro 2, you also have the same basic controls for your camera keyframes. You can create a keyframe at the beginning of the panel, at the current frame, or at the end of the panel. So for fun, let's add one at the beginning of the panel, and then let's add one at the current frame. So you'll notice that there are some new controls here on our camera keyframe. So if I drag on this, I can drag the position of my camera frame, but I can also rotate now an X from these handles on the side here. I can rotate in Y from these handles here. And then just like before, I can rotate in Z by mousing off the corner handle. And I can move it around from the center. So now you can move it from the center as well as being able to move it from the bottom handle. Some people might find it easier to work directly in the camera view because you could put your camera mask on there, and then you can really get the positioning of your camera exactly how you want it for that frame. And then I can go back to my first frame to check out what the positioning is at the first frame. So just remember though that when you're looking now in 3D Storyboard, you will no longer be able to accurately represent a three-dimensional camera move in 2D space. Meaning if you're doing your PDF export and you're looking at the first frame being here and the second frame being there, that second distorted frame is showing something, but it's not showing exactly what the framing looks like from here. And the reason that it can't show exactly what it looks like is because there's actually, if we take a look in the top view here, there's actually a movement happening not only in space, it's not only moving this way, but it's also rotating around. And particularly even if we do something like if we add, just by clicking and dragging on the control path, if we add a control keyframe there, then we can see how it really would be very difficult to be able to show the framing of the camera from the first frame to the last frame accurately. But what we can do here is when you're going to do something like a PDF export, you can add a snapshot, and that snapshot will show up in your PDF export. And so you might want to have more than one snapshot. If you're going to do some kind of what I would call a 3D camera move like we've done here, then you can add a camera snapshot at the first frame, and then you can add a camera snapshot at the end there. And then it will contain those two frames on your PDF export, so you'll really have a better sense of the movement that's happening for that camera. Now let me just show you another example. If I'm going to, let me add a new scene here, and I'll go back to my stage view in this scene, And I'll just make sure I do a Shift M there to reset my view. Let's reset the view. Okay, looks like it is reset. So if I want to do something a little bit different here, I just want to show you how you can also use two-dimensional layers, but you can rotate them or move them in space. So let me just take, actually I'll delete these other two layers. And I'll start out just with a BG. So let's do something really super easy. I've got a tree. And let's add another layer, layer A, and let's do another tree on layer A. And okay, so now that I've got those two, I might just want to move one in space with relation to the other. If I try to use my first frame tool, you'll notice that as long as I'm working in 2D mode, as long as I have not converted my scene to 3D, I can only reposition my two-dimensional layers in one axis, that is back and forth here. But if I want to move it actually backwards in space, then this is a situation in which you can actually convert your scene to 3D. And you'll notice that this is a new button now that you can find in your same toolbar that has your add scene and your add panel buttons. And if you don't see this convert to 3D button there, then you can right click on that header where you see the little buttons there, or the little dots, and then go to customize. And once you're in there, this is where you can, it would be over on the left hand side, and then you can select that, click the right facing arrow to add it, and now it's going to enable 3D on your scene. So if I click on OK, I can see my button there now. So what this button does is when you enable 3D on your scene, it basically unlocks those manipulators. So now that I've enabled 3D, I can choose to take my A layer and I can move it forward in space now. So you'll notice that I have the full freedom to move it left and right, front and back, and of course up and down from this view. And then you can also now rotate it, which is something new. We did not used to be able to do this. It might not necessarily be interesting when you're looking at something like a tree, but let's add one more layer. And I'll use this layer just to show something simple, like I will do a road. Let's say it's going to be a road that is kind of a curvy road. There we go. And I'll just put a dotted line going down the center of it. Very simple drawing to illustrate the point here. Now if I take this drawing and I use my 3D tool or my 3D transform tool on it because I'm using my first frame tool and my scene has enabled 3D already on it, then I can rotate this in space like that. So you can see how it becomes a little bit easier now to create these sort of 3D environments. And if you do something like you create a bit of an environment like this, and let's go back to my camera now, and I do a camera move. So I'll just add a keyframe at the beginning and at the end of the panel here. And then if you click on your last keyframe and you want to manipulate your last keyframe, let's say, I'll just go over here. I'll do it from my top view. Even if you're just going to do something really simple, like maybe you're going to move the camera up. Let's move our camera frame up and have it move down. Do you see that change in perspective? Do you see the multiplane happening? If you don't, then you can play around with trying to move these layers in space a little bit more. Let me go back and grab my transform tool there, my first frame tool, to move that tree further back perhaps. And now as I move through my scene, you can start to see that multiplane effect, even with a really very simple scene like this. And think of this scene, if you combine this with a 3D object, you could actually have a car, moving down this road in space. So it now becomes very easy to mix together two-dimensional layers that are rotated or moved around in space, all the way up to having 2D and 3D layers mixed together, and also having the ability to rotate your camera in 3D space, which is new. So we just talked about how easy it would be to rotate two-dimensional layers in space, to make use of the top view and the camera view and the stage view to plan your scene and order and layer your elements accordingly. But one of the things that I just wanted to, a quick trick to show you here when you're working with your camera, is that in order to edit your camera from the camera view, you have to be looking from the frame that you're editing. So you'll notice right now my playhead is halfway in between the first frame and the last frame, but I've selected my last frame. I can't edit the last frame from the camera view here. I don't see my manipulators. And the reason is that if I try to manipulate it from here, I'm not going to see exactly what that frame is showing. So if you're trying to do this, go to your tool properties, and then you'll see that there's a new button here to go to the selected keyframe. And then if you click on that button, it's just going to move your playhead to the appropriate position so that you can now go ahead and do something with that keyframe. Same thing if I click on my green one and I now want to go to the green one, I can click on the go to the selected keyframe, and then I can make some adjustments on this one. And then if I want to check out what's going on, I can just drag my playhead through the scene to see that camera move happening there. And if I wanted to now extract some of this information, then I can do my export to PDF, or I can export to a QuickTime if I want to preview that animatic in action. So I just finished showing you how we can lay out these layers in space and how we can take our camera and we can jump to the selected keyframe so that we can edit that camera from the camera view. But one other thing that sometimes as you're working along here, you might want to go back and add drawing layers or manipulate drawing layers. And remember that you can't draw really from your camera view, because your camera view will not always have your drawing layers, perpendicular to your camera. So sometimes it will work out here. If I try to draw on my camera view, it looks like it's working out in this case, but if my drawing layer, for example, had already been rotated in space, then I would no longer be able to draw on it. And the only place where you can draw on it is the stage view. So for example, that road has already been rotated in space. So if I try to take the road down there and draw on the road, you'll notice I get the no entry sign. So if you need to go back and make a modification to a specific layer, remember I showed you at the very beginning that you can set a shortcut for look at selected, and that will automatically move the stage view to match where that drawing layer is, to be perpendicular to it. But I also want to point out to you that we've added also a button here in the status bar of the stage view. So if you make sure that you're in stage view, because remember this is the only view where we can sort of rotate around our scene here. So if we're in our stage view and then you have your drawing layer selected and you click on look at selected, it's just going to make that perpendicular to your scene. So I could add some additional stuff to my road here. Same thing if I want to go back over to a new drawing layer, then I should do a look at selected. Maybe I want to draw a squirrel up in the tree here. Very good squirrel. Okay, so if you want to draw something on that layer, you just need to make sure that you have the look at selected. Otherwise, you won't be able to draw on it if you're not perpendicular to it. Like if my squirrel was rotated somehow in space, I would no longer be able to draw on it. So keep that in mind if you ever get stuck. If you are trying to draw on a drawing layer and you get a no entry sign, then it's probably because you're not perpendicular to it. So you can go into your stage view, into your status bar to the look at selected, and just click on that and you'll be able to draw on that now. Okay, so now we've talked about most of the stuff with relation to being able to rotate layers in space, to be able to animate your camera. What if sometimes you have moved some layers in space and you, by doing so, have converted something into 3D, which maybe you didn't want to? You'll notice that there is also a new button saying Reset Scene to 2D. and you can also find this in your storyboard, drop down menu there from the top. And if you add your reset to 2D here to your toolbar, then if you click on this button, what it's going to do is it's going to take all of your layers and it will automatically sort of flatten them back out, and it will rotate them back to be in a 2D space. So just be aware of this, because if you click on that button and then you realize you no longer see things in the way that you wanted to, then you can always undo and go back to 3D. Also, if you are working now in a scene that has some 3D elements in it, it will give you a warning message saying that if you try to reset this scene to 2D, it's actually going to delete the 3D models from the scene. So hopefully this is clear that if you go ahead with this operation, that it will delete those from the scene. And then if you want to drop them back in, they'll still exist in your library, but you'll have to drop them back in and reposition them. So at this point, I probably want to say no, I don't want to do that. And now one last thing with relation to animating the camera. Let's just let's take a look at it in this scene. Both scenes would work, but in this scene now, one of the other things that we can do with our camera is we can actually animate the field of view of the camera itself. So if you wanted to change how wide or how small that field of view of the camera is, you can go in your tool properties of your camera tool and you can change, this would be effectively your zoom level. So I can put this at 30 degrees if I want to. And now if I take a look at it in my top view, you can see how it's shrunk over time. So it's actually, zooming in on those frames over time. You can also do the same thing if you wanted to, for example, zoom out. So if I select that camera keyframe, then I can change this to whatever I'd want it to be. So I could make it 80 if I want it really zoomed out. And so we've made this so that it's a property that you could animate from your tool properties window, because it's usually something that you want to have a fine degree of control over when you're doing that zoom factor. So there's no handle for you to drag on. You have to go in your tool properties and actually type a number in here to animate that camera, or to change the camera lens. So even let's say if I want to create a brand new scene, and on this scene I'd like for my camera to have a different field of view. By default it's going to start at 41.1. I can change this to 30, or I can change it to 50, or whatever have you. If I don't have anything in my scene, I won't see the difference right away, but if I look in my top view, let's just pop these next to each other so that we can see as I do that what it looks like. So if I change this to 30, then you can see how the camera cone is changing on my camera. So you can just play around with these values, but 41 is a standard value, and then you can go all the way up to 50 millimeters or what have you. So that's how you do that. So one last thing to mention here before we wrap up this how-to tutorial for Storyboard Pro 3D is that you can also animate your layers over time in a very simple style of animation. And this is not very different from what we already did in previous versions of Storyboard Pro. So you would basically use your first frame and last frame tools. But you'll notice here now, if I'm working on a 3D object, I can manipulate the first frame and last frame on my 3D object, and I get that, that super transform tool to manipulate my object around. And then if you will play through your scene, then you can see now that ship animating there over time. Now I can do the same thing with my other layer. So I could position this layer to be over here, and then this layer to move closer into that ship. They're playing chicken with each other. Maybe I've got a bit of an odd camera move going for this scene, but it works. And then if I want to make my character come along with my ship as well, right now the character and the ship are separate layers, so you do have to animate these guys separately. So I can move now the position of my 2D layer there to match my 3D layer as it animates through the scene. So here's something else that you might run into when you start doing 3D camera moves in scenes where you have both three-dimensional objects and 2D drawing layers. In this scene, I'm doing some rotations on my camera, and I might start to see the side of my 2D layer so that it looks very flat. So if you want to avoid doing that, then you can click on your down arrow here to add the layers view. And the layers view allows us to adjust certain properties on a layer by layer, way here. So if I want to take my layer A, I can select for this layer always face camera. And then when I select that, it's just going to automatically keep that layer proportionately facing my camera. And I had some kind of a little bit of a transformation on that guy, and that's why it flipped him back over the other way. So if I'd like to be able to flip him to face the other direction, I should do it with my select tool instead of with my transform tool. And now that scene is going to work much better because he's always facing the camera. And so you would not want to use this property, for example, when you want to lay out a multiplane scene where you want to have different layers in space. So I would not want to take my road and put that property on for my road. I would not want to put it on for my trees. I may want to put it on for my squirrel if I always want my squirrel to face the camera, but it's up to you when you play around with these scenes how you want to make that look. I'd like to show you now a couple of the export options that you have available to you when you're using Storyboard Pro 3D. So the first one that we always use when we're doing a storyboard is the export to PDF. And remember that I mentioned a little bit earlier that when you're doing your export to PDF, if you add snapshots, it will do, one thumbnail for each snapshot. So let's just do a 3-panel vertical here with the selected scene. So I'll just select scene 2, and I'll export just that scene so that I can take a look at what it did for that scene. And then when we look here, you can see that it actually does 2 thumbnails for that one storyboard scene. And it shows the first thumbnail now is from the position of the in point of my camera, and the second one is from the position of the out point. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of where the camera starts, where it ends, and a hint of what happens in between. But you can see how it would be difficult to be able to show in more depth exactly what's happening between those 2 keyframes, which is why it helps if you want to have more than one snapshot. Let me just show you now, if you have some text on that, let me go over to my vertical view. And I'll just add a little bit of text. So let's say here, 3D camera move this scene. And action notes, let's have a young pirate struts on the stairs as the ships approach each other. Okay, so now that I've got some text in here, I'll do my export to PDF again just to show you what happens when there is some text. I'll do the same scene. Okay, so when we go down here now, you can see that when you have text, it's going to actually condense together all of the notes that you have for that whole scene into one section. So if I had action notes, dialogue notes, all that stuff would all show up within these 2, instead of being repeated like action notes, notes, action notes, notes, like you would normally see for regular frames that aren't tied together within the same scene. So it just makes it a little bit easier to organize that. And then, of course, if you're going to do an export to movie, then you have the same movie options that we've had in the previous versions of Storyboard Pro. You can export to QuickTime Movie. You can export to Flash SWF. When you do export to QuickTime Movie, you have available to you all of the compression settings that are on your machine. And so I could just do the one selected scene there, and you can print the time code on there. You can print a 4x3 safety even if you'd like to do that, or just simply a project safety. And then if I export that movie and check out what it does when it opens that movie, then you'll be able to see that it does a render of my scene with the OpenGL view of my 3D objects, with the OpenGL textures, the baked on textures, meaning that it never does a full render of your 3D scene with the lights and shaders from your original 3D file. It just uses that same approximation that you'll see within your storyboard scene, and this means it makes it very easy and light to work with. So let's look at some of the other options. Now, one of the other new options that we have for the export is the export to FBX. So if you're going to be going into a 3D software instead of into a 2D software, like a Toon Boom software, then you can do the export to FBX. And the export to FBX does something very similar to what the export to Toon Boom does. When you do your export to FBX, you can choose to have it export your camera frame and follow a file pattern. But generally what it does is it creates one scene file per scene file in Storyboard Pro 3D. So I'll just choose a directory here where I can stick this. And then it will create those scenes for me. So I created that scene on my desktop. So let's go to my untitled folder here. And you can see now it creates one FBX file per scene inside of my storyboard file. And if you open up your FBX file in your 3D program of choice, then what you can see there is it will contain all of your 3D objects. It will contain also your 2D objects, and it will have baked in the camera moves as well. So it will also have the right scene length. And then it will take the name of your storyboard file plus the name of the scene file there. By default, this is the naming convention, but you can also adjust this naming convention to suit your needs. So what's really nice about this is it saves that setup phase that you go through in a lot of projects where you're creating by hand hundreds of scene files with the right names and with the right scene length and with the right objects inside of it. So if you set up your storyboard file appropriately, you can really save yourself a lot of time and effort in the setup phase. So similarly, you can do the same thing when you're doing your export to Toon Boom. And in this case, just be aware that if you are going to be exporting to Animate or Animate Pro, since those products don't support the import of 3D objects, you'll need to use the rendered animatic option, which will just render out a movie for your Storyboard Pro 3D scene. And sometimes it can be useful to do this if you know that you want to rotoscope on top of your 3D objects and you just want to use this as a reference file. If you do want to remain consistent and have access to your 3D objects, then of course it's recommended that you go with Harmony 9.2. And if you're working with the Harmony standalone option, then you can choose offline. If you're working in the network or the database, then you can choose to database. And then it will do the same thing that it would do with the FBX, where it will create one scene file per scene in your file in Storyboard Pro. And if you choose original scene, it will keep these vector elements as vector elements and the 3D objects as 3D objects. And then you can simply open up your Toon Boom file and get started right away. And then you'll notice that there's a new option here for sounds, to process the sounds individually, to keep the original sounds, to merge all soundtracks. And what this is, we used to always keep original files. But what happened was we didn't want to chop up or adjust any of your sound files. And when we did this, we would copy the contents of your sound into each scene inside of your Harmony file. So if you had one really long sound file that was quite large, this sound file would be copied into every scene, and it could make your harmony files very large as well. So what we did to address that was we can now process the soundtracks individually, which will cut each individual soundtrack to the appropriate length for that scene. In other words, it will cut after where you don't need it. So you won't be able to do too much sound adjustment afterwards, but it will make your file size much lighter. And if you want to go even a step further, you can merge all of the soundtracks down to one soundtrack as well. And just like we would have before, you have the export to CSV to export your Excel file that will track all of your tracking information. You have the export to EDL AF XML for your Avid, for Final Cut Pro, for Premiere. And this is a new export soundtrack, which will just export the sound alone. And then we still have the confirmation export, but be aware that the confirmation export does not work with Final Cut Pro X because they changed the XML format. So you will have to stick with previous versions of Final Cut Pro if you're using the confirmation export. So that's it for the introductory tutorial here on Storyboard Pro 3D. I showed you how to import 3D objects, how to manipulate two-dimensional objects in 3D space, how to upgrade your scene to 3D so that you can use your 3D tools on it, and then how to export your project to PDF, to Movie, to Toon Boom, to FBX. There are one or two advanced tips that I'll show in the next video for if you're going to work with complicated 3D objects, or if you want to make use of the 3D nodes view. So if you're interested in those topics, then check out the next video.